René Lévesque was sunk with the PQ ship. It was all over in 1985. And somebody had to be appointed as the premier. So Pierre-Marc Johnson, a quiet fellow, nice enough fellow, what I would call a timid separatist, stepped into the fray, became the premier in effect. And I drew this one cartoon that I thought summed it up. Sometimes you sum it with one cartoon, you can sum up personality. He's wearing a blue Quebec blazer, but underneath he's got a Canadian sweater with a symbol on it. He was not a hardcore nationalist, and indeed in the future 1995 referendum wouldn't even take a stance on it. Robert Bourassa came back with a storm at that time and took Pierre-Marc Johnson on in an election and won quite handily. And suddenly Bourassa was preoccupied with his good friend Brian Mulroney. The PQ quietly, very quietly, decided to have a leadership review, and Jacques Parizeau, a prominent figure and a very hardcore nationalist, won the leadership. We puzzled over where he had been. In fact, I drew him as Elvis Presley, he was supposedly dead. But he was back, and he was back with one issue on his mind. He wanted Quebec to leave Canada. He was the hardcore nationalist. So he began saying things like, why doesn't Canada just let Quebec go? Otherwise it's going to be like a non-stop visit to the dentist for Canadians. A lot of people agreed with him. In any case, Bourassa died, unfortunately, a very week later. Pierre-Marc Johnson's brother, Daniel Johnson, took over the Liberal Party. Again, a sort of a nice enough guy, but a week later. And Parizeau beat him very handily, and I drew this very dramatic cartoon of him at the time, of him winning the election as Jacques the Ripper. In other words, the guy who was going to rip Canada apart. And indeed, there were no flies on Jacques Parizeau. He called for a referendum the following year. 1994 had been the election. He wanted a 1995 referendum. He wanted to get this thing done right away. The thing about Parizeau, he wasn't as popular as you might think. He made a lot of people, the English obviously were nervous, but a lot of Francophones were nervous about him. And the referendum campaign kind of went along, and he was limping along only at 35–40% popularity. He had compared it to a hockey game, in fact, so I drew him here in the third period, all beat up, and he wasn't winning this thing, obviously. There was a figure who was the most popular figure in Quebec at the time, was Lucien Bouchard, who had been a Tory cabinet minister, formed the Bloc Quebecois in Ottawa, and was doing very, very well up there with Gilles Duceppe and his cohorts. So it was decided to bring Lucien Bouchard in and take over the referendum campaign, in effect. Here he is tripping up Parizeau in the third period and taking over the team. He brought the final vote, he brought it in only 50,000 votes short of winning. It was astonishing, and it was a scary time for Quebec. Jacques Parizeau was quite bitter about this, and the day after the election, he said, and he was quite drunk at the time, obviously, he said he blamed it on money and the ethnic vote. It was over, clearly over for Jacques Parizeau. He was going to be gone. Again, I drew this cartoon of him saying salut, holding a glass. The signature, if you'll notice, says Ethnic 95. That's how I signed the cartoon. So we were almost cooked. We were almost like lobsters in the pot. Lucien Bouchard brought it that close. My favorite cartoon, actually, of the whole referendum was 2 days after, when it's a couple on a balcony. It could be in Saint-Henri or any place here in Montreal. And Sylvie up above is taking down her We posters. And Frank in the floor below is taking down his No posters. In other words, we got back to being ourselves. Lucien Bouchard hung on, and in fact took on the new Liberal leader, Jean Charest, in 1998. Very pleased with this drawing because it sums up sort of a Quebec attitude about things. Lucien Bouchard, wrapped in the big flag, wins the hearts of Quebecers, as nationalists do. The sensible Jean Charest, the money man on the other hand, waving a little flag, wins the minds of Quebecers. He's the sensible guy who's going to introduce financial policies. And indeed, he eventually became premier for a very long, successful period. But that cartoon for me sums it up, the two attitudes in Quebec that tugs at the hearts and minds of Quebecers. I personally have to thank Lucien Bouchard for one of the greatest gifts ever for a cartoonist. He gave me a language minister by the name of Louise Baudouin. And I did cartoon after cartoon after cartoon of Louise, putting these language policies, quite severe language policies in place. And in the English community, she was seen as being really, really heavy-handed, almost a dominatrix. So this evolved in the cartoons. I drew her as a dominatrix with whips and cattle prods and this, that, and the other. Quebec is a very unique place, though, because at first she was furious about these cartoons. She thought I was drawing her as an SS officer. I wrote a letter to La Presse saying, no, we're just dominatrix, and it's a classic English fantasy to be, sexual fantasy to be dominated anyway. So she got it.